The desert exhales heat like a furnace breathing its last. North Africa, February 1943, and the land itself seems exhausted by war, bleached bone white under a sun that offers no mercy. At Biskra airfield in Algeria, the air shimmers with mirages that dance above cracked earth, and dust devils spiral lazily between rows of aircraft that squat like great metallic locusts waiting to take flight. The B-17s rest heavily on their landing gear, their olive drab paint faded and streaked with oil stains, each bearing the scars of previous missions, patched bullet holes, replaced panels, hastily painted squadron markings that never quite matched the weathered original paint. The men of the 414th Bomb Squadron, 97th Bomb Group, move through the pre-dawn darkness with the weary efficiency of those who have done this too many times. They are young, most of them, but their youth has been compressed and aged by the alchemy of combat, transformed into something harder and more brittle. They smoke cigarettes cupped in their palms against the wind, trade jokes that aren't quite funny, check and recheck equipment with fingers that know every buckle and strap by touch alone. Some write letters they may never send. Others simply stand and stare at the horizon, where the first pale suggestions of dawn begin to bleed into the eastern sky. The B-17F designated 41 to 24,406 bears the name, All American, painted proudly across her nose. She is a flying fortress in the truest sense, for Wright Cyclone engines capable of delivering 1,200 horsepower each, 13.50 caliber machine guns bristling from every angle, designed to carry her crew and 4,000 pounds of bombs deep into enemy territory and bring them home again. She is aluminum and steel, rivets and cables, fuel and ammunition, but to her crew she is something more. She is a promise, fragile as all promises in war, that home still exists somewhere beyond the horizon. Lieutenant Kendrick R. Bragg, the pilot, climbs aboard with the deliberate movements of a man performing a ritual. He is 23 years old, though his eyes belong to someone older. His hands move across the controls with practiced familiarity: throttles, mixture controls, prop pitch, trim tabs. The cockpit smells of oil and rubber, and the faint metallic tang of oxygen. His co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Godfrey Engel, settles into the right seat, and together they begin the pre-flight checklist, their voices low and steady, a litany of switches and gauges, pressures and temperatures, each response a small confirmation that the machine is ready, that they are ready, that they will lift this metal cathedral into the sky once more. Behind them, the crew takes their positions. The bombardier in the plexiglass nose, where the world spreads out beneath him in terrible clarity. The navigator with his maps and charts, calculating winds and headings, trying to impose order on the chaos of three-dimensional warfare. The radio operator with his key and his headset, the lifeline to other aircraft, to command, to the world beyond their own aluminum skin. The flight engineer monitoring 1,000 moving parts, listening to the engines with an ear tuned to hear the slightest irregularity. The ball turret gunner, who will spend the mission curled like a fetus in his rotating sphere beneath the fuselage, the smallest man on the crew, suspended between earth and sky with nothing but plexiglass between him and the fall. The waist gunners, who will stand at their open windows for hours, wind screaming past at 200 miles per hour, scanning the sky for the dark cruciform shapes of German fighters. And in the tail, isolated and alone, the tail gunner, Sergeant Harry L. Hottman, who will spend the mission crawling backward through the narrow tunnel of the fuselage to reach his position, where he will crouch in his tiny compartment, the most vulnerable spot on the aircraft, watching their 6 o'clock, guarding the door they cannot lock. The engines cough to life one by one, each starter engaging with a grinding roar that becomes a steady thunder as the propellers catch and spin and blur into circles of light. The sound builds, multiplies, as other aircraft in the formation fire up their engines, until the entire airfield vibrates with mechanical fury, the ground trembling as if the earth itself is trying to throw them off. Bragg advances the throttles, feeling the bomber strain against her brakes, eager or merely obedient to physics. The control tower fires a green flare, and the first aircraft begins to roll. They take off in sequence, each bomber lumbering down the runway with agonizing slowness, fighting gravity with thrust and lift and sheer stubborn momentum until the moment when the wheels leave Earth and they are airborne, that instant of transformation when a collection of metal parts becomes something capable of flight. The All-American lifts off into air already warming with the rising sun, Bragg easing back on the yoke, feeling the controls respond, the bomber climbing in a steady arc as the desert falls away beneath them. They circle the field, gaining altitude, joining the formation that assembles in the sky like a flock of enormous mechanical birds, each finding its place in the combat box, that geometric arrangement designed to maximize defensive firepower, to create a flying fortress not from one aircraft but from many. The formation turns south and east, toward Tunisia, toward the target, toward the war that has consumed North Africa in a campaign of thrust and counter-thrust across desert wastes that care nothing for the ambitions of men. Below them, the landscape unfolds in shades of tan and ochre, trackless expanses broken by wadis and escarpments, the occasional cluster of palms marking some precious source of water. The sky is crystalline blue, cloudless, offering nowhere to hide. This is naked flying, exposed and vulnerable, and every man aboard knows it. They scan the sky constantly, quarter by quarter, altitude by altitude, searching for the glint of sunlight on canopy, the dark speck that grows suddenly larger, the contrail that marks an enemy's approach. The mission is straightforward in the way that all bombing missions are straightforward on paper. Fly to Bizerta, bomb the port facilities, return to base. Simple. Except that Bizerta is defended by German flak batteries that can bracket a formation with deadly accuracy, and by Luftwaffe fighters based at nearby airfields, and the route takes them over territory held by Axis forces who will report their progress, vectoring interceptors to meet them. Simple, yes, in the way that walking a tightrope over fire is simple. You either make it across or you don't. They drone eastward, the formation holding tight, each aircraft taking cues from the lead bomber, maintaining position through constant small corrections, the pilots fighting turbulence and prop wash and the natural tendency of the heavy bombers to wander. The gunners test fire their weapons, short bursts that sound thin and distant inside the aircraft, drowned by engine noise. The intercom crackles with position reports, oxygen checks, the routine communications that mark the passage of time aloft. An hour passes. Then another. The sun climbs higher, and inside the unheated aircraft, the temperature plummets as they reach altitude. The men are bundled in leather and sheepskin, but the cold finds every gap, every opening, seeps into bones and joints until fingers grow clumsy and faces go numb. The coast appears on the horizon, a dark line separating desert from sea, and beyond it, Tunisia. The bombardier calls out landmarks, the navigator confirms their position, and the formation begins its final approach to the target. This is when the tension peaks, when every man knows that they are committed, that there is no turning back, that for the next minutes or hours they will fly straight and level into whatever the enemy throws at them. The intercom chatter fades. Each man settles into his position, into himself, finding whatever private reserve of courage or fatalism will carry him through the next minutes. The flak begins before they reach the coast, black puffs of smoke blossoming in the air around them, each marking the explosion of an 88mm shell that has reached altitude and detonated in a spray of shrapnel. The formation flies through it, maintaining course, and the aircraft shudder with near misses, metal fragments sleeting against aluminum skin. One bomber trails smoke. Another falls out of formation, losing altitude, heading for home or trying to. The rest fly on. This is the calculus of strategic bombing, acceptable losses, measured against military objectives, as if mathematics could somehow balance the scales of men's lives against tons of steel and concrete destroyed. Then the fighters come. They drop out of the sun, where they have been waiting, climbing to altitude while the bombers plodded toward the target. Messerschmitt Bf.109s, sleek and deadly, painted in the mottled camouflage of the Luftwaffe, diving at speeds the bombers cannot hope to match. The German pilots are good, veterans of the Eastern Front and the Battle of Britain, and they know the B-17's weaknesses. They come from 12 o'clock high and 6 o'clock low, from the angles where the defensive fire is weakest, pressing their attacks with a courage that matches the bomber crew's own. The sky erupts. Tracer rounds streak past in streams of light, red and orange, crisscrossing the air like deadly fireworks. The bombers' guns hammer in response, the gunners tracking targets, leading them, firing in long bursts that drain ammunition boxes and fill the aircraft with the acrid smell of cordite. Shell casings cascade across the floor, hot brass bouncing and rolling with the aircraft's movements. The intercom explodes with shouts. "Fighter 3 o'clock level! Got him! Bogey diving on the lead! Brake right!" A chaos of voices trying to warn and coordinate, and simply bear witness to what they're seeing. Bragg holds the All-American steady, trusting his gunners, focusing on formation, knowing that to break away is to die alone. The aircraft shakes as their guns fire, shakes again as something impacts the airframe, a burst of machine gun fire or shrapnel, impossible to tell. The instrument panel is a blur of needles and dials, everything reading within limits, engines humming their steady song of power. The co-pilot calls out damage reports as they filter up from the crew. A hole in the left wing. Hydraulic pressure dropping. Oil temperature rising on number 3 engine. Nothing critical. Not yet. One of the Messerschmitts presses its attack too close, diving through the formation's defensive fire, its guns winking as it strafes a bomber ahead of them. The German pilot is good, threading the needle between aircraft, his fighter's engine screaming as he dives. But he has misjudged something, speed or distance, or the wind that buffets them all at 23,000 feet, and suddenly he is not diving past them but through them, and there is no time to react, no time for anything but the terrible mathematics of collision. The Messerschmitt's wing catches the All-American just aft of the radio room, and the universe becomes sound and fury. The impact is instantaneous and catastrophic, metal meeting metal at a combined speed of over 400 miles per hour, and the laws of physics do not negotiate. The German fighter's wing shears through the B-17's fuselage like an axe through kindling, slicing through aluminum skin and structural members and control cables, opening a wound that nearly severs the bomber in two. The fighter tumbles away, mortally damaged, its pilot's fate unknown and unknowable in the chaos. The All-American lurches, the tail section dropping, held to the rest of the aircraft by little more than the floor structure and a few twisted members of the frame. Inside the bomber, the world has gone mad. The sound of the impact is beyond sound, a physical blow that deafens and stuns. The aircraft yaws violently to the right, the tail swinging loose like a pendulum. The control cables have been severed or damaged, and suddenly Bragg is fighting an aircraft that does not want to respond, that bucks and shakes like a dying animal. The wheel in his hands feels wrong, slack in some directions, rigid in others. He stamps on the rudder pedals, trying to correct the yaw, and one pedal moves, the other barely responds. Beside him, Engel is scanning the instruments, calling out readings, trying to make sense of readings that no longer make sense. The intercom is chaos, voices overlapping, some shouting, some eerily calm. The radio operator is reporting major structural damage, can see daylight where there should be solid fuselage. The waist gunners are describing a scene of destruction that sounds impossible. The entire tail section hanging by what looks like a thread, the horizontal stabilizer canted at a strange angle, skin panels torn and flapping in the slipstream. And from the tail comes silence. Harry Hottman, the tail gunner, is not responding. Bragg's training takes over, the countless hours of drill and practice, the muscle memory that survives when conscious thought fails. He reduces power on the engines, trying to slow the aircraft, to reduce the stress on the damaged structure. He tries the trim tabs, finding that some still respond, using them to help stabilize the aircraft. Slowly, agonizingly, he begins to regain a measure of control. The All-American is still flying, still somehow staying aloft, though every instinct and every bit of aeronautical knowledge says she should have broken apart already. The tail section should have torn free, sending the aircraft into an uncontrollable spin. They should be falling. But they are not falling. Against all reason, the aircraft holds together. The fuselage flexes and groans, metal screaming in protest, but it holds. Bragg eases into a shallow turn, pointing the nose west, toward home, toward Algeria, toward life. Each moment that passes without the aircraft breaking apart is a gift, a borrowed second that they have no right to expect. He calls for damage reports, trying to assess what they have left, what they've lost. The waist gunners work their way aft, climbing over ammunition boxes and equipment, squeezing past the ball turret, moving toward the severed section. They find devastation, a wound that runs nearly the entire diameter of the fuselage, the skin peeled back and torn, structural members twisted and broken, the interior of the aircraft open to the sky. And beyond it, impossibly, the tail section still attached, hanging at a slight downward angle, swaying gently with the aircraft's movement like a trailer being towed. The horizontal stabilizer and vertical fin are intact, as are the tail guns, and in that tiny compartment at the very end of the aircraft, Harry Hottman is alive. He had felt the impact, felt his section of the aircraft drop and sway, had watched in horror as the fuselage ahead of him opened up, revealing the sky and the other bombers in formation and the terrible gap that now separated him from his crewmates. He had thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that he was about to die. That the tail would tear free and he would fall, still strapped in his gunner's position, 23,000 feet to the desert below. But the fall had not come. The tail continued to hang on, buffeted by wind, shaking with every movement of the aircraft, but holding. And so he remained at his post, manning his guns, because there was nothing else to do, nowhere else to go, and if they were still flying, then his job was to guard their six. The formation has left them behind. This is doctrine, the harsh calculus of war. A damaged aircraft cannot keep up, and the formation cannot slow down, cannot wait, cannot risk additional aircraft to protect one that is probably doomed anyway. The All-American is alone in enemy sky, limping westward at reduced speed, an easy target for any fighter that finds them. Bragg calls for the bombardier to salvo the bombs, to dump everything they're carrying. The added weight and drag could be the difference between making it home and breaking apart, and the mission, whatever their target was, no longer matters. Only survival matters now. The bombs fall away, tumbling toward the desert below, and the aircraft rises slightly, unburdened. But she still feels wrong in Bragg's hands, still wants to your right, still shudders and shakes with vibrations that propagate through the airframe like a living thing in pain. He adjusts trim, adjusts power, trying to find some configuration that will keep them airborne, that will coax a few more miles out of this wounded bird. Engel monitors the fuel gauges, calculating range, trying to determine if they have enough to make it back to Biskra. The math is not encouraging. They drone westward through a sky that has become both enemy and salvation. Every 1,000 feet of altitude is potential energy, stored height that could be traded for distance if the engines fail. Every minute that passes brings them closer to friendly territory, but also drains fuel from tanks that cannot be refilled. The engines run steady, their song unchanged, but everyone aboard knows that this could change in an instant, that a fuel line could rupture, that an oil leak could turn into an engine fire, that the damaged structure could finally give way. They fly in a bubble of suspended consequence, and time itself feels strange, elastic, each second stretching and compressing. The crew works with desperate efficiency. The flight engineer monitors every gauge, every indicator, ready to shut down an engine or transfer fuel or do whatever might be necessary to keep them aloft. The radio operator tries to raise friendly forces, to warn them of their approach, to request emergency assistance. The navigator plots their course with obsessive precision, giving Bragg headings that will take them over the most direct route, avoid known flak concentrations, bring them home by the shortest possible path. The bombardier and the gunners watch the sky, still searching for fighters, still ready to defend their aircraft even though they all know that another attack would almost certainly finish them. In the tail, Harry Hottman has become intimately acquainted with every creak and groan of his section of the aircraft. He can feel it flex with turbulence, can feel the wind trying to tear it away, can see the gap ahead of him where the fuselage should be continuous but isn't. He tries not to think about the precariousness of his position, tries not to calculate the odds of the tail section holding together, tries instead to focus on his guns, on the sky behind them, on the job he was trained to do. But it is impossible not to be aware that he is riding in what amounts to a mechanical afterthought, held to the rest of the aircraft by faith and fractured metal. The desert unfolds below them, unchanging and indifferent. Somewhere down there is the front line, that imaginary boundary where friendly forces end and enemy forces begin, though from altitude it all looks the same, Empty land, scoured by wind, ancient beyond the concerns of this modern war. They cross it without ceremony, without acknowledgement, heading deeper into Allied-held territory with every mile. Bragg allows himself a small measure of hope. If they can just keep flying. If the aircraft can just hold together a little longer. If the engines don't fail. If the fuel holds out. If. An hour passes in this fashion, time measured in fuel consumed and distance covered, in the persistent vibration that never ceases, in the wind howling through the torn fuselage, in the cold that seeps into every part of the aircraft despite the sun blazing outside. Another bomber appears off their wing, having broken from the formation for its own reasons, and the crew takes comfort in not being alone, in having at least one other aircraft nearby, though what help they could offer each other is unclear. They fly in loose formation, two damaged birds limping homeward. The radio crackles to life. Biskra has received their message, understands their situation, is preparing for their arrival. Emergency crews are being alerted. Ambulances are standing by. The runway is being cleared. The news is both comforting and terrifying. It makes their situation real in a way it hasn't been, confirms that what they are attempting is dangerous enough to warrant emergency preparations, that the ground crews expect the worst. Bragg acknowledges the transmission, keeps flying. Another 30 minutes. Fuel gauges dropping toward empty. They are committed now, no longer have enough fuel to divert to an alternate field. It's Biskra or nothing, and Biskra is still 100 miles away. Bragg does the math in his head, compares it against Engel's calculations, and they arrive at the same conclusion: it will be close. Very close. He reduces power further, leaning out the mixture, trying to squeeze every last mile out of their remaining fuel. The airspeed drops. The aircraft mushes through the air, balancing on the edge of a stall, flying at the minimum speed that will keep them airborne. The tail section sways more noticeably, the weight and drag fighting the reduced thrust from the engines. Then they see it, a smudge on the western horizon that resolves into the airfield at Biskra, the runways visible as dark lines against the lighter desert, the buildings and tents and aircraft scattered around the perimeter. Home. Almost home. Bragg calls the tower, declares an emergency, requests clearance for straight-in approach. He is not going to circle, not going to do anything that might stress the aircraft more than absolutely necessary. The tower clears them immediately, ordering all other traffic to clear the pattern. The field is theirs. Engel begins the landing checklist, and Bragg follows along, but many of the items are irrelevant now. Landing gear, they can only hope it comes down. Flaps, they'll find out when they try to extend them. Hydraulics, already compromised. They descend, trading altitude for approach, aiming for the runway threshold. Bragg extends the landing gear and waits, listening for the sound of wheels locking into place, watching for the indicator lights. 2 green lights appear. The nose gear and one main. The other main gear's indicator remains dark. They have no way of knowing if the gear is actually down or if the indicator is simply damaged. They will find out when they try to land. The flaps extend partially, then stop, the hydraulic system unable to provide enough pressure to move them further. It will have to be enough. Bragg adjusts his approach, coming in faster than normal to compensate for the reduced flap setting, steeper to clear obstacles at the runway threshold. The aircraft feels alien in his hands, the controls responding in unexpected ways, the whole machine feeling like it might come apart with any sudden movement. He flies it gently, tenderly, like coaxing a frightened animal, making small corrections, trying to keep everything stable. The runway rises up to meet them. Bragg can see trucks and ambulances lined up along the taxiway, can see crews running out to watch, can imagine their expressions as they see the all-American approach, see the gaping wound in her fuselage, see the tail section hanging by a thread. He blocks it all out, focuses on airspeed and altitude, on the runway numbers growing larger, on the threshold passing beneath them. He flares, pulling back on the yoke, raising the nose, bleeding off speed. The wheels touch, the aircraft settling onto the runway with surprising gentleness. The tail section hits next, slamming down harder, and for one terrible moment Bragg thinks it will tear free, that they will lose it here, now, on the ground, after everything. But it holds. Miraculously, impossibly, it holds. He applies the brakes, feeling them grab unevenly, the aircraft pulling to one side. He corrects with rudder, with differential braking, fighting to keep them on the runway, to bring them to a stop before they run out of pavement. The propellers spin down, the engines coughing into silence, and the All-American rolls to a stop halfway down the runway. The sudden quiet is overwhelming, thunderous in its completeness. The wind, no longer drowned by engines, whistles through the torn fuselage. Dust settles around them. They have landed. No one moves for a long moment. The crew sits in their positions, stunned by survival, unable to quite believe that they are on the ground, that they made it, that they are alive. Then movement returns, and they begin to unbuckle, to stand on shaking legs, to work their way toward the exits. Bragg and Engel remain in the cockpit, hands still on the controls, as if letting go might somehow reverse what they have accomplished. Behind them, the crew emerges into brilliant sunlight, dropping from the hatches, stumbling away from the aircraft on legs that have forgotten how to support weight without the constant vibration of flight. Harry Hottman climbs out of the tail section, making his way forward carefully, stepping over the gap, and when he reaches his crewmates, they embrace him as if he has returned from the dead. In a sense, he has. They all have. The ground crews arrive at a run, and stop short when they see the damage. The photographs will be taken soon, images that will become iconic. The All-American's fuselage nearly severed, the tail hanging on by what looks like sheer will, and across the nose, clearly visible, the proud words, All-American, still intact. The mechanics circle the aircraft slowly, shaking their heads in disbelief, touching the torn metal as if to confirm it is real. They have seen damaged aircraft before, have patched holes and replaced panels and pronounced machines unflyable. But they have never seen anything like this. The B-17 is a tough aircraft, legendary for its ability to absorb punishment and keep flying, but this surpasses any story they have heard. This aircraft should not have been able to fly. By every measure of structural integrity and aerodynamics, it should have broken apart at 23,000 feet over Tunisia. Yet here it sits, battered and torn but whole. The crew is taken to debriefing, where intelligence officers ask them to describe what happened, to identify the location of the attack, the number of enemy fighters, the type of damage sustained. The men answer the questions mechanically, still numb, still processing. They describe the collision, the sound and shock of impact, the desperate flight home. The officers write it all down, fitting their experience into forms and reports, transforming lived terror into data. But even as they speak, even as they try to reduce what happened to coordinates and timelines and tactical assessments, the crew members find themselves struggling to articulate what it felt like. How do you describe the moment when you realize you should be dead but aren't? How do you put into words the sensation of flying in an aircraft that has become more absence than presence, more gap than structure? Bragg tries to explain the feel of the controls, how they responded in ways that made no sense according to his training, how he flew more by instinct than by any rational understanding of aerodynamics. Engel describes watching the instruments and realizing that the readings didn't match what was happening, that they were flying in a state that the gauges had no way to measure. The waist gunners talk about the view aft, about seeing Harry Hottman in his tail position, separated from them by 30 feet of nothing, and yet still there, still at his guns, still doing his job. They talk about the wind, how it screamed through the aircraft with a sound they never heard before, how it was cold, beyond anything they'd experienced at altitude, because it wasn't just the cold of thin air but the cold of exposure, of being naked to the sky. They talk about how they expected, with every passing second, to feel the aircraft break apart beneath them, to experience that final lurch as the tail tore free and they entered the spin from which there would be no recovery. Harry Hottman sits quiet through most of the debriefing, and when they ask him directly what it was like in the tail, he struggles to find words. What can he say? That he prayed? That he sang songs under his breath, the same songs his mother used to sing when he was small? That he talked to the aircraft, whispering to her, begging her to hold on, promising things he had no authority to promise if she would just stay together a little longer? These are not things that go into official reports. These are not tactical observations or useful intelligence. So he says it was scary, and he kept his guns manned, and he's glad they made it home. The officers write this down, and it becomes part of the record, these inadequate words standing in for an experience that cannot be adequately conveyed. Later there will be medals and citations, official recognition of extraordinary airmanship and courage under fire. But in this moment, in the debriefing room, it feels anticlimactic, a bureaucratic coda to something that defies documentation. The forms cannot capture what happened today, cannot preserve the essential truth of it. They can record facts, altitude, airspeed, location, time, but they cannot record the texture of survival, the specific quality of grace or luck or providence that kept 10 men alive when by all rights they should have died. Outside, the All-American sits on the runway where she stopped, too damaged to be moved without risk of breaking apart. She will be salvaged for parts, her engines removed, her instruments harvested, her guns redistributed to other aircraft. The airframe itself is beyond repair, the structural damage too severe. She flew her last mission today, brought her crew home one final time, and now she will be broken down and scattered across other aircraft, her component parts living on while the whole is lost. It seems a tragedy, but it is the logic of war, where machines are consumed in pursuit of objectives that may or may not matter in the longer calculus of history. But before the salvage begins, before she is dismantled and dispersed, the photographers come. They capture her from every angle, documenting the impossible damage, the miracle of her survival. The images will be reproduced in newspapers and magazines, will become part of the legend of the B-17 flying fortress, will be used in training manuals and recruitment posters. They will show the wound in her fuselage, and viewers will marvel that she flew. They will show the tail section hanging by threads of metal, and people will shake their heads in disbelief. And they will show, clearly visible across her nose, the name, All-American. And it will become more than just one aircraft's designation. It will become a symbol of resilience, of the ability to endure impossible damage and still complete the mission, of American industrial might and ingenuity, and sheer stubborn refusal to quit. The story will be told and retold, and with each retelling it will change slightly, details added or altered, the narrative shaped by the needs of the moment. In some versions, the German pilot deliberately rammed the bomber, a kamikaze attack before such tactics had an aim. In others, the tail gunner is trapped and isolated for the entire flight home, unable to communicate with the rest of the crew. Some accounts will emphasize the pilot's skill, others the aircraft's toughness, still others the intervention of providence or luck or fate. The truth, as always, is more complex and less satisfying than any single narrative can capture. It is about skill and luck, about mechanical resilience and human determination, about the intersection of chance and choice in a moment of crisis. Kendrick Bragg will return to flying, will complete his tour of duty, will survive the war and go home to a life that has nothing to do with bombers or combat, or the weight of responsibility for 9 other men's lives. Harry Hottman will do the same, though he will never quite forget the sensation of riding in that tail section, separated from the rest of the aircraft by 30 feet of air, held aloft by forces he could neither see nor understand. The other crew members will scatter to their own fates, some completing the war unscathed, others not. They will stay in touch for a while, the bond of shared survival keeping them connected, but time and distance will do what enemy fighters could not, and eventually they will drift apart, becoming strangers who once knew each other in the most intimate way possible, through mutual dependence in the face of death. The All-American herself will vanish into the maw of war, her parts scattered, her registration number eventually reassigned or retired. But the photographs will remain, and the story will remain, passed down through generations of airmen, told in ready rooms and classrooms and wherever people gather to speak of aviation and war. It will become one of those touchstone stories, a parable about what is possible when everything seems impossible, a reminder that machines and men can sometimes exceed every reasonable expectation. Sitting on the runway at Biskra that afternoon, her crew gone to debriefing and her future already decided, the All-American appears less like a miracle and more like what she always was, a collection of aluminum and steel, rivets and cables, shaped by engineers and built by workers, designed to a specific purpose and used accordingly. The wound in her fuselage gapes open to the African sun. The tail section hangs at that strange angle, obviously wrong. She will never fly again. But for one impossible day, she defied every law that should have governed her fate, and she brought her crew home. In the end, that is all that matters. That is what she was built for, what every bomber was built for, not to deliver bombs or to win wars, but to bring the men inside her home again. The sun descends toward the western horizon, stretching shadows across the airfield. Mechanics have begun to gather around the aircraft, taking measurements, assessing what can be salvaged, making plans for the dismantling that will begin tomorrow. The wind picks up, blowing dust through the torn fuselage, whistling through the gap between the aircraft's front and rear sections, and the all-American creaks and groans, metal flexing in the heat, as if speaking a language only she understands. Perhaps she is telling the story of her last flight, of the impossible things she did, of the 10 men who trusted her and whom she did not betray. Or perhaps she is simply steel and aluminum, responding to thermal expansion and wind pressure, without consciousness or intent. But those who were there, who saw her land with her tail hanging by a thread, who watched her crew emerge alive and whole, they will always believe she was something more. They will carry that belief with them, that conviction that machines can transcend their specifications, that in moments of extremity some quality emerges that cannot be reduced to engineering or luck, something that deserves to be called will or courage or grace. Whether this is true or merely necessary to believe cannot be determined. What is certain is that on February 1, 1943, a bomber that should have fallen from the sky refused to fall. She flew damaged and broken through hostile sky, limped across 100 miles of desert, and touched down safely on a runway in Algeria with 10 living men aboard. The ground crews finished their initial assessment and dispersed to their evening duties. Darkness falls over the airfield, bringing the cold desert night, and the All-American sits alone on the runway, monument to her own impossible survival. In the morning, they will begin to take her apart, to reduce her to components and spare parts, to erase her individual identity and redistribute her substance across the Air Force. But tonight she remains whole, still wearing her name across her nose, still bearing the scars of her final mission. Tonight she is still the All-American, the bomber that refused to die, the machine that brought her crew home against every reasonable expectation. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all any of us can hope for, to exceed expectations when everything is on the line, to hold together when we should fall apart, to complete the mission we were designed for even when damaged beyond what should be reparable. The All-American did this, and in doing so, became more than the sum of her parts, became a story that would outlive the aluminum and steel, that would persist in memory and retelling long after the last rivet had been removed and the last photograph had faded. The war will continue for more than 2 years after this day, will consume thousands more aircraft and tens of thousands more lives before it exhausts itself and ends. The All-American story will be one among millions, a single thread in a tapestry too vast to comprehend in its entirety. But for 10 men, for Kendrick Bragg and Godfrey Engel and Harry Hottman and the 7 others whose names history has recorded but whose individual stories remain largely untold, it will always be the story that mattered most. It will be the day they should have died but didn't, the day they flew a bomber home that had no right to fly, the day they learned that the line between life and death is thinner than aluminum skin and more fragile than a control cable, but also somehow stronger than either, held together by will and skill and perhaps by something that has no name, but is recognized by anyone who has ever faced impossible odds and prevailed. The stars emerge above Biskra, the same stars that have watched over this desert for millennia, indifferent to the brief drama of human conflict. The All-American sits beneath them, slowly cooling, metal contracting with the dropping temperature, making small sounds that echo across the empty runway. And if you listen carefully, if you knew what to listen for, you might hear in those sounds the ghost of engines, the remembered thunder of 4 Wright cyclones carrying 10 men home through a sky that tried to kill them. You might hear the wind through a torn fuselage, the crackle of radios, the staccato hammer of machine guns. You might hear voices, terse and frightened and grimly determined, calling out positions and damage and hope against hope that the next second would not be their last. But the night is silent now, and the All-American has nothing left to say. She has told her story in the only way that matters, by surviving, by landing, by delivering her crew safely home. Tomorrow they will begin to take her apart, but tonight she rests whole, a testament to what was possible on one impossible day in February 1943, when a bomber that should have fallen from the sky refused to fall, and 10 men who should have died instead lived to tell the tale. That is enough. That is everything.